Morning, everybody. Take me a second to get everything aligned on this end. So bear with me. Had a little trouble with my camera, but that seems to be fixed at this point. All right. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We've got the JIRA Brown Bag, or the NDi Presents Brown Bag series. My name is Dave Hopkins, and I'm going to be talking about software estimation today. If you have any questions, you should be able to post them in the YouTube window. On the right-hand side, there's a little chat, and I should see those come up in my window here. If there's anybody that wants to give me a little quick test, make sure that it works, then that would be awesome. And we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, share my screen over here. Okay, so Network Designs Incorporated, and this is part of our Brown Bag series. We're doing these every week. The first and third Friday will be a new presentation. The second and fourth Friday will be free for you to either watch the presentation or come up with something else that you need for us to see. All right. Thanks, Greg. Greg thinks that my office is nice. Clearly, he is looking beyond the mess. So here we go. All right. So clearly, I didn't finish the PowerPoint. Oops. We're going to do this PowerPoint list today. Either that or I downloaded the wrong one. Let's switch back to video for a second while I figure out which direction we're going to go. What I think we're going to do instead is use the JIRA Notes page that I'm using to do the trainings with. I should be able to use that just fine as my presentation. All right. Oh my goodness. All right, let's try this again. So if you haven't noticed, I've got a bug in my machine, and I have not been able to get it out. And the FAA Help Desk has not been able to find it either. So they actually sent me a new laptop. I'm very excited about that. All right, here is the page we're going to use. So the agenda basically is we're going to talk about story points, the advantages of them, time, how time affects your estimates, the estimation process, and then come to our conclusions, and I'll give you a list of resources and such. So software estimation, as we're using it, is software estimation in general is a little difficult because you've got so many factors involved that it requires experience, and everybody's going to look at those factors differently based on their experience. As a developer, software estimation is one of the more difficult components of your tasks because you have to take into account all of the risks involved, as well as all of the time that it's going to take you personally, as well as all of the availability, your system and its speed. And for each developer, those factors are all going to be different. Your systems are going to work better than mine, hopefully. You're going to have a faster return rate on certain development projects based on their language. You might be faster at cold fusion, where I might be faster at C+. All of those factors are going to come into play. So when you take into account all of the different factors, we use all of these components to make the informed decision right before we start the sprint on how we're going to complete that sprint and what we're going to include in it. So essentially, we're looking at story points. That's the element that we use to track our estimates. Each story, or each task in our case, we break the stories down into multiple components. Each of those components is a task. Each of those tasks needs to be estimated before they can be pulled from the backlog and thrown into the sprint itself. When they're in the sprint, we use that 2-week sprint window of ours, and based on our velocity, which is how many points we know we can accomplish in 2 weeks, that's how many points we pull out of the backlog and throw into that sprint. So the story points basically run over a couple of elements. When estimating, we want to look at how long we think the story is going to take. And if you look at the screen, I'm right around this area here. These estimates are influenced by the complexity, any risks, any uncertainties, and the volume of work associated with that issue or that task. When you're dealing with story points, we want to look at relative values. That's what's the key. We can't really look at hours based on your guess, because your guess is going to be different than my guess. If I look at something in cold fusion and I say it could take me 5 hours to do that, somebody else is going to look at that and say, oh, it's only going to take me 2 hours. So we want to look at a relative guess that's going to be equal for both of us, more like a complexity or something that's made up. It doesn't have to be factual. It just has to be equal in your eyes and in mine. So looking at it relative basically indicates that a 4 is double of a 2. So if we rate something at a 2 value, then a 4 is going to be twice as hard. Obviously, the more often you do this, the more consistent your numbers become. So it's very important to choose the methodology that you're going to use for your estimating and to stick with it. You don't want to start estimating in one style, move on to another style, and then move on to a third style. You want to get consistent with your styles so that you're always estimating, thinking large is large, 4 is 4, so on and so on. So when you're doing your story points, the points have to be assigned in agreement. There should be a quorum for every story assignment. If you've got 5 people in the room, 4 of them should agree that this story is a 5 versus a 3. If you've got someone else, half of you think it's a 2, 2 more of you think it's a 5, then there's some serious disparity and you all have to come to the quorum. So you keep going around and discussing it until we come up with the right number, to an appropriate number that we can all agree upon after we've heard everyone's opinions. Okay, several different ways to do your estimating, and this will all start to make sense a little bit once I get some of the groundwork done here. So your points have to be agreed upon before you're estimating. So again, that's the style that you're going to use. And here's a couple of styles, and these are by all means not the limit. There are dozens of different ways to do this, but these are the most common. Planning poker. Planning poker is the one that I like to use the best. It's the most flexible. It's the most fun. It's not always the quickest because there's a tool involved, but it is definitely the most fun. So planning poker focuses on a Fibonacci scale. It's not a perfect Fibonacci scale, but it's based on that, where you have different values leading up to infinity, and there's about 10 of them. And they go, the scale is listed here. It's 0, 1/2, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, 40, and there's a couple in the middle, and then 100. Then the last one is infinity. So you would assign this particular task that we're estimating to one of those cards, essentially, and everyone needs to agree that that's a value that is equal for that card. Another methodology is t-shirt sizes or pant sizes, I've heard. Extra small, small, medium, large, extra large, and double X. Just indicating that this is either very, very simple or very, very complex. One of the classes I took on estimating and software development, the guy used zoo points, which I thought was kind of fun, but it requires a lot of pre-work. So you have to define what the values are. So I threw a couple up here for you: a blue whale versus a rhino versus a lion versus a koala versus a lizard. For example, you'd have small, medium, large, extra large, and then infinity being the whale. You can use a simple numeric scale, 1 to 5, 5 being the biggest, 1 being the smallest. That's also a very common one. If you've got a very small project, you can even knock it down 1 to 3. It's either a 1, a 2, or a 3. In any case, anytime that you have a relative value, so that's what we're calling the story points, is a relative value, that would equate a value of more than whatever, and we have to determine what whatever is, those stories should be broken down. So let's say that your relative value in planning poker, you've assigned this a 20, and you've decided that 20 is too big a single element. That element should be broken down into smaller tasks, subtasks if you want, or subcomponents, however you want to break it down, but they should be broken down so that they're nothing bigger than a 5, or you've got 4 5s in there, or you can have a 13, a 5, and a 3, 13, a 5, and a 4, something like that, to be able to break them down into something smaller than whatever you deem is the largest element that you want to tackle. If we're looking at zoo points, we could say we don't want anything bigger than a rhino. Rhino's our limit. But above rhino, we also have the elephant classification and the whale classification. So if you find a whale, we need to break it down into a bunch of rhinos. It's a little harder to do that with a 1 to 5 because typically 1 to 5 is a smaller project and you can work a 5 into your environment with no problem. If you were running a 1 to 10, for example, you could have the cutoff being an 8 or a 7, where a 1 to 5 is common. If you're getting a 6 or a 7, you're pushing your limits. Anything over 7, 8, 9, or 10 needs to be broken down into substantially smaller elements. All right. So an example, I found this example a couple of weeks ago and I really liked it. 2 runners take the same trail and they're both going to estimate this trail. They're going to sit back and then one is going to say that the trail is going to take me 10 minutes to run it. The other runner is going to say this trail is going to take me 20 minutes to run it. But from another perspective, both runners look at that and say that that trail is equally 1 mile. So clearly, runner A is a faster runner than runner B. But they're both looking at 1 mile. If both runners agree that the distance is a mile, they have a common unit to determine points for a future run. So the next run that comes up is a 5-mile run, and they both agree that it's a 5-mile run, and one guy says it's going to take me 50 minutes, and the other guy says it's going to take me 2 hours. But they both agree on the distance. They both agree on the value of the point. So that's where the commonality has to come into play. And again, it makes substantially more sense if we start using the same methodology for the estimates every single time. that pretty clear so far? All right, great. No questions yet? Still plugging along? So we've got the baseline down. Now we're going to start looking at the advantages of doing story points and how time relates to it. I think we're moving along pretty quickly. I might not have a full hour here. Story points are additive, just like any other number. So if you have a story that's a 5, and you have another story that's a 3, now you've got 8. Another story that's a 5, now you got 13. And you know your velocity is 20. You've got 18 points pulled out of your backlog. You're pretty much reaching your limit. You can either let it loose at 18, or you can find a 1 or a 2 or 2 1s and a 2 or something like that out of the backlog if you've got some smaller breakdowns in there, and pull those in as well to get to that 20 velocity for your team. Story points allow people with a different skill set to estimate equally. Again, that's why it's important to, like we set up above, it's important to select a certain style of estimating, like planning poker, and use that over and over and over again. This allows everyone's estimates to be equal and common. So we've all agreed what a 5 is or what a 20 is. We've all agreed that we won't have anything bigger than a 20. So if it's a 20, we have to break it down. So as soon as a task comes up and I throw a 20 card out, everybody knows I mean that it needs to be broken into smaller pieces. I can somehow see smaller pieces coming out of this that would be much easier to handle. Story points help avoid problems with unit confusion. Again, it's that standardization. Once we realize that we're going to be breaking this into pieces and we're going to be looking at all of the pieces the same, we all start talking about the same numbers and we all start estimating in the same common ground. We stop having to worry about, oh, I just lost my place. We stop having to worry about this guy thinking that it's a higher estimate than this guy and throwing hours out there based on his skill level versus the newer developer's skill level thinking that it's, you know, a much larger task when the more advanced guy realizes that it's really not. All right, so time. So let's stop on story points for a second. We've got a clear understanding of what I'm talking about when I talk about story points. Now let's look at time, because we have to understand the basis of points as nothing more than agreed upon values of effort level. And we have to have a basic understanding of time and the variables that come into play with time. Then we take the two of those and we melt them together to come up with the estimation process. All right, so time. You have two kinds of time. You have ideal time and elapsed time. And of course, we all know that when we sit down, and we've done this 1,000 times, oh, I see that task. It's only going to take me a couple of hours, so I'll give it to you in 4 hours. 3 days later, the client comes back and says, you said it was only going to take 4 hours. And you respond to him by saying, yes, but I haven't had 4 hours yet. So your ideal time is that 4 hours, but that assumes that it's the only thing you're going to do, and no one is going to bother you, and everything that you need is right there perfectly, which really isn't the case. It's almost never the case. There's always going to be someone walking by. There's always going to be something more important for you to do. Someone's going to come up with a priority that has to take priority over the project you just took. You're going to have a computer like this one that I'm working on, which doesn't work the same every single day. There's always going to be something wrong. So how do you equate that to providing the product to the customer in that 4 hours? It's actually the elapsed time. So in an ideal world, your Monday is 8 hours long. But the reality is that your Monday is 8 hours, but you've got 2 hours worth of meetings, you have 2 hours worth of email, and you actually got 4 hours worth of work to complete. But in that time, you're breaking out for lunch and walk-bys and answering the phone and checking emails and all of that stuff. So it could take you 3 days to get 4 hours worth of work completed. One of the hardest things to remember is when a client comes to you and says, how long is this going to take? Is to answer him in elapsed time. And that's one of the caveats. That's why I have that in a big red marker here. Whenever you're asked, how long is this going to take? Are you answering the question that they really asked? Are you thinking elapsed time or ideal time or story points or some other innocuous estimation that you just pulled out? What is it that you're giving them actually? How are you actually answering the question? So when your customer came and said, yeah, it's only going to take me 4 hours, but I'm going to need 2 weeks to be able to give you that 4 hours of time. And in that 2 weeks, you take time to make sure that all your equipment is working, that all of the components you need for the task are there. Every question is answered about the task, and you have blocked aside 1 hour for the next 4 days to do nothing but that. You're going to shut the door, put your headphones on, turn off your cell phone, lock the world out for an hour a day just to complete this project. Okay, so good understanding of what I'm talking about when I talk about time. There's the ideal time and the elapsed time, and a good understanding of story points or the agreed upon value for estimating that we're labeling story points. So next part is the actual estimation. The actual estimation is really a complicated way of turning actual time or ideal time into actual time into story points. So when I say it's a 5 story point task, you can extrapolate from that. It's going to take 4 days. So the process is a little complicated. It's not difficult, but there are a few steps that we have to go through. So when you're estimating, everybody puts forth their estimate as the bid. You sit around a table, the project owner or the PM or the BA, whoever's most knowledgeable about this feature, expresses the feature. He explains top and bottom, inside and out about the feature. And you estimate the feature. If the feature is already broken into tasks, then he estimates the feature, and then you, as the developer sitting around the table, estimate the individual tasks. Or you can estimate the feature, break it down into individual tasks. That's kind of a sticky point depending on who's running the show and who wants to do it which direction. But overall, you estimate the feature. So everybody throws their bid out and you discuss why you weighted it the way you did. So I put it as a 5. The next guy put it as a 3. Ryan's online, I see him. He puts it as a 2 because I know he's fast. So everybody weights it the way they did, and then you discuss it. Well, Ryan, why did you come up with a 2 when I said it's a 5? Did you think about X, Y, and Z? Ryan might say, oh, no, I didn't think about that. You're closer to, as a 5, I'm going to up mine to a 4. So now we've got a 5, a 3, and a 4. Ryan could turn around and go, oh no, I think you're thinking about this, but those are already developed. So if you do it this way, it's going to take you half the time because all those subcomponents are reusable. And I would sit back and go, oh, you're right. I'm going to change mine to a 2. That's the discussion component. You go through that cycle, that iteration, rebuilding or rebidding every time, rediscussing the options, the risks, and any concerns that might have until everyone agrees on using the same bid. So everybody has to agree, again, as a quorum, that we're all going to use a 4 or we're all going to use a 2. It doesn't really matter what it is as long as everybody agrees. You only estimate the tasks from the backlog up to and slightly beyond your next sprint or 2. Now you should be estimating tasks at the beginning of the project as a large bulk. You don't estimate every single task. You estimate the larger features or the epics if you want. And those estimates are rough, just for planning purposes, to be able to get an idea of where the project is going to stretch to. But when you break into the backlog to actually lay out each sprint, you're only estimating enough tasks to equal your next sprint or 2. And at the beginning of every sprint, you should re-estimate the backlog again for the next sprint or 2. So you're always a sprint ahead, but you're going to re-look at it because each time you look at it, you have more knowledge. You've done a retrospective, you've completed a few sprints, you have a different understanding. More experience is the key. You understand your velocity better personally as well as the velocity of the team, and you can look at this task again and say, oh, hey, I was exactly right on that, or I'm going to adjust my value. So again, you're going to re-estimate every sprint for the next sprint or 2. The reason I say sprint or 2 is because you might get into a position where it's a holiday, not everybody's there. You don't want to take the extra time to do another sprints estimation. So you can just pull off the top and run through the next couple of tickets in the next sprint because you have fewer people, you'll have a lower velocity, so you'll have pre-estimated tickets for that sprint. So another warning that I've got in here, when bidding, it's often necessary for someone to concede to a common bid. It's often necessary to use an average in order to move forward, but I don't recommend you make this a habit. I like using the quorum method. It's kind of a cross between forcing everyone to be on the same exact number and using an estimate. I'm using an average rather. With the quorum, if you've got 5, 4 need to agree. If you've got 10, 8 need to agree. It's not majority, it's much higher than that. So I like using the 80% to 90% rule. So any questions so far? I know we are tearing through this one today. I'm still going to have to go back and fix that startup screen. All right, so that's the primary understanding for estimations. We're going to look at different ways because like I said, I prefer planning poker. So we're going to look at planning poker, and then we're going to take and turn those estimates into actuals. So planning poker is a game. It's played with a deck of cards, and we have 2 decks at the office. If you need to use them, see Lindsay, she'll get them to you. It's agile estimating and planning technique. I'm reading it right off the screen here. That is consensus based. To start the poker session, the product owner or the customer reads the agile user story and describes the feature to the estimators. Again, the estimators should only be the developers or the people involved with that task to complete it. So by the developers, I'm including, if it's a graphics task, you're talking about the graphics designers, they're the estimators. If it's a writing task, you're talking about the tech writers or the PMs that are doing the actual writing, they're the estimators. Okay? So everyone discusses the feature task, and the estimator selects the appropriate card from his deck. All the cards are turned over at the same time, and if the selections are the same, then you use that as your estimate. And I added or very close because, again, I use the quorum. Otherwise, you go to the person who is the furthest off and have them discuss why they chose that number. So if everybody's running 4 and 5 and you've got a 2, I want to know either what that person is missing, or like in the example before, Ryan knows that he's already pre-built a dozen plugins that I can call when I'm doing this task that I didn't know about. I thought I'd have to write all of those, but they're all done. So his 2 is actually legitimate, and the rest of us at 4 and 5 are way off because nobody knows that he finished that work yet. So that's basically it. And you go around until you have that quorum. You use the planning poker card decks. Again, Lindsay's got them. You agree on the scale to be used within that deck. So you're not using every card. If we remember the deck goes 1/2, 1, 2, 3, 5, and then up to infinity, we might only choose 5 values. Maybe we have a 1, a 5, a 10, a 50, and an infinity. But you agree on the deck, or you agree on the values, and then you bid based on those cards that you have in your hand. Now that bid can change, or the agreed upon values can change based on the type of bidding you're doing. So if you're estimating features at a really high level, you can use a larger scale. Use the 50 to infinity. Don't use 1 to 50. If you're bidding on tight little broken down tasks, stick from 1 to 10, or maybe you'll need a half to 6. The key though is to make sure you're always using the same complete scale and the same method so that the values always have the same equivalent. At the beginning of the project, if you value something a 100 at the story level, it should be broken out into 200 1/2 points by the time you're done. Is that clear to everybody? I'm kind of hoping it is. Very quiet audience today. I'm getting chuckles and giggles from the chat window. Appreciate that, guys. All right. So how do we turn estimates into actuals and the actuals into a prospectus? This is where estimating becomes the most difficult. Assuming that you've got all of your tasks estimated properly, well, assuming you've got all your features estimated globally in the project, and then all of your tasks estimated properly as you're going, and you're tracking your actuals in the tasks as you're completing them. At the end of 2 or 3 sprints, you will have a true team velocity. You'll be able to look and say, we estimated this first sprint's tasks, there were 50 points in this. And we got 45 points done, and we billed 45 points. So we estimated 50, we accomplished 45, and we agree that we accomplished 45. So that first sprint's velocity was 45 points. The second sprint, we did the same thing. We estimated 50, we accomplished 50. In the third sprint, we estimated 50, but we only accomplished 40. So we take 50, 40, and 45, and we average those. I'm not using a calculator. Let's average that to 45. So we have an average velocity of 45. On the fourth sprint, you should not include 50 points. You should only include 45. By including 45 points as our average and including 45 points as our sprint value, we can now prospect that our total project of 500 points, because we've estimated the total values of every single feature, we can now accumulate those, let's call it 500. And we know that in 2 weeks' time, we can complete 45 on average. We can shoot out and say that this project at 500 points is going to take us 10 sprints or 20 weeks to complete. Is that simple enough? It's clear so far. Excellent. So an example here that I've got on the screen. You estimated that you'd be able to complete 40 points in your 2-week sprint, but life and business get in the way and you actually completed 35. So your velocity is 35 for every sprint every 2 weeks. If you have 200 points left in your backlog, you can extrapolate that it's going to take you 6 more sprints or 12 more weeks to complete that 200 points. Make sense so far? So the hard part behind coming up with your velocity is agreeing where to start. So in that example I used, we started with 50 points, 50 story points, but we were only able to complete 45 the first week. We started with 50 the second week, and we were able to complete the whole 50. We started with 50 the third week, but we were only able to complete 40. So what the difficult part of this is coming up with that, where do you start? I've always recommended starting low and building up to your limit. So you start with what the team believes they can accomplish. Because we don't have the experience in the estimation of this particular project, say it's our first sprint, we look at the tasks that are there and we say, yeah, I can do that in 2 weeks, and I can do this with that in 2 weeks, and I can do these top 3 things in 2 weeks, and I can do these top 4 things in 2 weeks, all out of the backlog. I think I can do that. And the team says, now, how many points is that? Okay, there's 4 tasks there, and they're each 5 points. So there's 20 points for our first sprint. Let's run with that and see what happens. Well, if you finish early, it's easier to add a task to the sprint late in the game than it is to take tasks out of the sprint in the middle. So if you start with a 20 and by the end of the first week, everyone is twiddling their thumbs, clearly you underestimated. Throw another 10 in it from the backlog into the project sprint. That will increase the scope of that sprint, but you clearly can handle that, and see how that takes you. When you get to the end now, you're at the Thursday, right? You're at the last 2 days of the second week, and you are wrapping up that 30 points. That is a much better estimate, because now you can say, oh, we can do 32 points or maybe 34 points as our velocity on the next one, rather than trying for 50 and only finishing 20. So for me, it's easier to get rolling on a lighter scale and then scrolling up into the volume. The next hard part is waiting for the 2 or 3 weeks or the 2 or 3 sprints to finish before you set your velocity into stone, you want to be able to have a good estimated value of a true velocity before you really do a prospectus, okay? Before you push it out into how long are we going to take. Because there are values in these sprints, or there are risks in these sprints that we may not be aware of on a new project. Now, if we were going to throw this method into DRS, for example, it's going to be a totally different ballgame because these guys are in their 10th sprint or their 13th sprint now. They know, without even looking at the tasks, what their velocity is and what their estimations are. They have the experience in the team. They have the experience in the environment. They have the experience with their hardware that they're using. Everything is in place for them to get that velocity wrapped up. So we should be able to go back and come up with a velocity estimate for a team like that. And then on the next sprint, assign that averaged velocity to the sprint in backlog points, and it should be exactly the amount of work they can complete. Friday afternoon, they should be pushing publish on the final component with no time to spare and no work left undone. The other thing to remember, and this is where as developers we bump into the corporate heads a lot with this, is the further we go through the project, using DRS as another as an example again, the further we go into the project, the more accurate we become, because the more experience we have in this environment with this task, with these people, with these machines, so on and so on and so on. At the end, of course, the easier it is and the more accurate your estimates are going to be for when the project is going to be completed. Those, of course, are barring any unforeseen risks, losing valuable employees. I know DRS just went through a bunch of headaches because they lost 3 or 4 employees. So there's some turnaround in there. So the new people are having to regain the incumbent knowledge that was lost. So there's going to be slowdowns in the estimates. The velocities could change for the next couple of weeks, but you would expect those to settle down after 2 or 3 weeks, just like at the beginning of a project. So the conclusion is basically that using these simple techniques to come up with your actual duration in sprint count, which equates to weeks, a team should be able to completely, with no pre-existing concept of point values, come to a clear understanding of relative values for every story that they're being faced with. And they should be able to, in a very short time, come up with a velocity that will give them those prospective numbers, those prospective durations. And again, it comes to fighting with the PM. Oh, the client wants to know a deadline. Well, let us estimate the stories first. We'll give you an approximate duration. And then 4 or 5 sprints into it, we can reevaluate that approximate and give you a much more accurate duration, which could unfortunately push it out further or could fortunately bring it in closer. The sooner your team starts tracking points and estimating their stories and their tickets, the more effective these valuations will become. You can't go back and try and estimate the story or the task after it's completed, because you're losing that valuation, that estimate to actual valuation, which is where you learn. Well, I thought it would take me 4, but it actually only took me 2. Or I thought it would take me 4, but it actually took me 12 because I ran into these problems, which I foresee running into every single time. Difficult client, I have an old PC that's not working. My connection to the test system is flaky and it's never going to get any better. All those kinds of things. So estimating at the beginning of the project and at the beginning of every sprint is imperative. Putting your actuals into the tickets is imperative, because otherwise you're not going to be able to accomplish that velocity rating, to come up with that velocity rating at the end of the sprint segment. So the goal is to have every team become more adept at estimating new stories and developing its own scale for points that will factor into its own individual velocities that it can carry into every project it runs. So just like everything else, experience matters. The longer this team works together, the better off they're going to be. The easier it's going to be to work together, the easier it's going to be to estimate together, and the more accurate your estimates and your velocities will become. All right, so how am I doing? We got 10 minutes left. We got plenty of time for questions. I can't believe I didn't get the slide deck finished. I totally spaced on that, so you'll have to forgive me. I'll get it done and I'll have it uploaded here probably tomorrow or Monday. I'll get it done Monday. All right, any other questions? No questions. All right, that'll take care of it then. Thank you all for joining. Let me stop the screen share. And, you know, as usual, if you guys have any problems or issues, just give me a holler. You know how to get a hold of me. There's, on the Confluence page that I was using, there's a bunch of great links. If you want to check out more about Planning Poker, I highly recommend it. Go to planningpoker.com. And there's two things there. The first part is it's written by Mountain Goat Software. So there's a link to the Mountain Goat Software Planning Poker explanation there. But there's also, if you have a distributed team like we typically do, planningpoker.com is an online free Planning Poker slide deck. So you each log in, you create your own account, you get on the conference call, everybody talks about what's going on, you choose your cards, and you publish it at the same time as everybody else, and you can see everybody's selection just like you were sitting around a conference table, flipping cards down on the table. So it's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool times with other projects. So if you have any questions about how Planning Poker works specifically, or anything else about estimating, give me a ring. That pretty much wraps it up. Thank you all for joining. This video will be back live once I fix that screen at the beginning. And so that'll take care of it. Thanks, guys, for joining.